All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going deep, really deep into something, that's probably crossed your mind, I'm sure. Whenever you get lost in a good story, a book, a movie, whatever, it's like, what are these fictional characters really? Like Sherlock Holmes or, the whole world of Harry Potter. Are they just things we make up? Or is there something more to them? And today we're going to try to unpack all of this and really think like philosophers.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're diving into the nature and existence of fictional
That's
entities.
right.
It's a bit of a mind bender,
Yeah, it really is.
but it's a fun one. If you've ever like thought about what it even means to say that Hamlet is, a tragic hero, or if you've wondered if Hogwarts has any kind of reality to it, then this deep dive is for you.
That's it. That's it.
We're going to be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on fictional entities. And, that's kind of our philosopher's toolkit for this.
That's
We're going to dissect these questions. And the goal is to make all these sometimes confusing philosophical ideas clear and, as fun as possible.
Yeah.
So you can, sharpen your own philosophical thinking about fiction.
right, right. So, okay, let's put on our philosopher hats because we're going deep. And it all boils down to two big, big questions. First, if these fictional characters were real, in some sense, what kind of things would they be? Like, what's their fundamental nature? That's the
Mhm.
metaphysical question. Then there's the ontological question. Do they even exist at all? Like, at all, in any way, shape, or form? It kind of feels like a no-brainer, of course not. But no, when you
Mm.
look at it philosophically, it gets really, really complex and interesting.
Exactly. And it's interesting to see that even philosophers who say no, they don't exist, they still start from a shared point, a shared observation,
Okay.
which the Stanford Encyclopedia calls the non-existence datum. And it's simply the intuitive idea that Sherlock Holmes isn't, out there solving crimes in London today. And Hamlet's not brooding in some castle in Denmark. Even those who think fictional entities are real in some way, they admit that they don't exist in the same way you and I do.
Right. It seems so obvious, but here's where it gets really interesting. We get that these guys aren't physically here, but the fact that we can talk about them, analyze them, even feel emotional about their stories, well, it raises some big questions. If they don't exist, what are we even discussing? What makes us so sure they don't exist in some other way? It's like a simple question that opens up a Pandora's box of philosophical stuff.
Yeah, and as philosophers, we got to be precise. Like when we say there are things like fictional things that don't exist, are we contradicting ourselves? The anti-realists, those who deny fictional entities, they see this as loose talk, a kind of shorthand. But the realists, the ones who think they exist in some way, they might take it more literally. Like there are different ways things can be, different ways to talk about what exists. And some of those ways might include things that, we usually think of as not existing. This is what philosophers do. They pick apart even the most basic things we say.
Okay, so let's put on our thinking caps here. We're going to look at some big theories about what fictional entities are.
Mm.
And our first stop is possibilism. So in simple terms, what's the idea here?
Okay, so possibilism.
Yeah.
It uses this idea of possible worlds. And that's a tool that philosophers use a lot for thought experiments.
Hmm.
And the idea is that fictional entities, they don't exist in our world, the actual world, but they do exist in other possible worlds, worlds where the stories about them are actually true. So think of it like this. Philosophers can imagine all sorts of ways the world could have been. And possibilists say, hey, in some of those possibilities, Sherlock Holmes is a real detective on Baker Street. The point is that something not existing in our world doesn't mean it's just, totally nothing.
Okay, that sounds pretty straightforward, but I remember from our reading that this view has a bit of a problem, a snag. Too many potential Holmeses.
Ah, yeah, classic philosophical puzzle. So if there are lots of possible worlds where, the Holmes stories happen, each with a detective who's basically the same,
Yeah.
which one of those guys is the Sherlock Holmes that we talk about?
Yeah.
It's like the problem of too many choices, ontologically speaking, it's indeterminacy. Like the stories don't tell us every single detail about Holmes. There could be tons of Holmes candidates, different in tiny ways.
Oh, yeah.
So without a way to pick one definitively, can we really say that any of them is Sherlock Holmes? As the philosopher Saul Kripke would ask, for if so, which one?
Right. It's like if we have a myth about a magical sword, Excalibur, and we imagine all these worlds where there's a sword that fits the description, none of them really feels like the Excalibur.
Exactly. And Kripke used that very idea about Excalibur to challenge possibilism. He said, even if we found a sword in another world with all those properties, it wouldn't be Excalibur. So why should a detective in another world who fits the Holmes stories be the fictional Sherlock Holmes? What makes him the Holmes that we think and talk about?
Right, right. Okay, but the Stanford entry, it mentions a possible solution for possibilism using David Lewis's counterpart theory.
Right, so Lewis, he was a big philosopher, known for his work on possible worlds, and he had this idea that, yes, each of these Holmes candidates, they exist in their own world. They're not identical to each other. But he said there's this thing called a counterpart relationship.
Okay.
So for someone in our world who's read the Holmes stories, each Holmes candidate in these other worlds is a counterpart to all the others. They're all the guy called Holmes that you or your counterparts in those worlds learn about through the stories. So it's less about being the same person across worlds and more about like a relationship of representation or similarity that lets us talk about Sherlock Holmes.
So it's kind of a clever way to sidestep that which one problem.
Right.
But R4 says that, counterpart theory isn't accepted by everyone. What are some other ways that possibilists try to deal with these issues?
Well, there's another approach called modal monongenism, and it tries to combine possibilism with the ideas of Alexius Meinon. He was a philosopher who was all about like the nature of things that don't exist. So modal monongenism says that fictional individuals like Holmes, they do exist in our actual world, but as non-existent things.
Okay.
But, and this is the modal part, they also exist in other possible worlds where the Holmes stories are true.
Right.
So it's like Doyle isn't picking a Holmes from a bunch of options. He's aiming at one specific Holmes who just happens to not exist here, but does exist somewhere else.
Okay. So it's like a philosophical ghost in our reality.
Kind of, yeah. But then there's the problem of how do authors even pick out these non-existent objects with specific identities?
Right. How does Doyle, just by thinking and writing, pick out one non-existent Holmes from all the other possible ones?
Exactly. It's a tough question.
And then there's the problem of properties. Like, if Holmes only truly exists in other worlds, does he actually have the properties we talk about, like his brilliant deductions?
Right. This is a big challenge for possibilism. It suggests that fictional entities only possibly have the properties they're given. Like, Holmes isn't actually a detective. He only possibly is.
Right.
But that seems weird. When we say Holmes is smarter than any real detective, we're comparing him to real people, not just possibilities.
Right. It's like we're saying he actually is smarter, not just possibly smarter.
Yeah, and it also messes with how we think about emotions in fiction. We admire Holmes, we feel for tragic characters, but how can we have those feelings if their traits are just possibilities?
It's like we feel those emotions in a real way, not just a possible way.
Exactly. The Stanford entry also mentions how possibilism deals with stories that have contradictions. Like, sometimes they have to use the idea of impossible worlds where contradictions are true.
Impossible worlds.
Okay,
That's something we can explore another time. But for now, let's move on to another big idea. Meinong and neo-Meinongianism.
Okay, so Meinongianism, this goes right at the heart of non-existent things. Unlike possibilism, which says they exist somewhere else, Meinongianism says straight up, there are things that have no being whatsoever.
Okay.
Meinong, he was all about categories, and he said there are real things like you and me, ideal things like numbers, and then things that just lack being, like a golden mountain or a round square.
Right.
He said there's a difference between having properties and existing. He called these Sosine and Sina. So his radical idea was something can have properties even if it doesn't exist in any way. That's a big one to wrap your head around.
Yeah, it is. So, like, the Golden Mountain doesn't exist at all, but it's still accurate to say it's golden and it's a mountain.
Right. A central idea here is the characterization principle. And basically it says that a thing has the properties that it's characterized as having.
Okay.
So the Golden Mountain is described as golden and a mountain, so it is those things. And for fictional objects, it means they're defined by the properties they have in the stories. So Holmes is clever because that's how the stories describe him.
Okay, so that solves that problem of him only possibly being clever.
Right, exactly.
Now, the Stanford entry talks about concrete and abstract neo-Meinongianism. What's the difference there?
So concrete neo-Meinongians, they say that these objects, they don't exist, but they're still concrete in the sense that their properties are the kind of physical, observable things, like being a mountain, being a detective. So Holmes is concrete, but non-existent. He has all the properties the stories give him.
So concrete because of the kind of properties, but abstract because they don't actually exist.
Exactly. Now, abstract neo-Meinongianism is a bit different. They say that these objects do exist, but in a non-spatiotemporal way. So they exist like math objects or abstract roles, like how the number 7 exists but isn't a physical thing. Holmes exists in this abstract way. He just doesn't have a place in space and time.
Okay, so there's a big difference there.
Right.
Now, our source also talked about this debate within neo-Meinongianism about two kinds of properties versus two modes of predication. What's that all about?
So this is about how we can say things like Anna Karenina committed suicide,
Hmm.
which is true in the story, but also say that she didn't really die because she's fictional.
Right, right.
So some neo-Meinongians say there are two types of properties: nuclear properties, which are the ones from the story, and extranuclear properties, which are about being fictional,
Okay.
like Mickey Mouse being a pop culture icon. The problem is this distinction always clear?
Yeah, it's kind of blurry. Like, where do you draw the line?
Right. So the other approach is to say there are two ways to say that a thing has a property. Like Zalta, he says fictional entities encode properties, which are the ones from the story, and ordinary individuals exemplify properties.
Okay.
So Anna Karenina encodes being a woman and committing suicide, but she exemplifies being fictional. This way, you can kind of deal with the complexities a bit better.
It sounds like the modes of predication view is a bit more powerful there.
Yeah, a lot of philosophers think so, though there are still some critics.
Right. Now, what are some of the good things about neo-Meinongianism in general?
Well, one good thing is that it explains why we think fictional entities have to have the properties they're given. Like, it's hard to imagine Holmes not being a detective. Neo-Meinongianism has ways to explain that.
Okay.
Also, it gives a clear way to say when two fictional entities are the same, they're the same if they have all the same nuclear properties. So we can tell when we're talking about the same character.
That makes sense. But then there's that problem from the text about just any random set of properties creating a fictional entity, right?
Right, like the example of an Oscar who loves garden gloves and the number 17. Just listing properties doesn't seem to be enough to make a fictional entity. So neo-Meinongians say that fictional objects are correlates of sets of properties, not just the sets themselves. There has to be something more, like a story or an act of creation. But even that has problems, like that Pierre Menard Don Quixote thing.
Ah, yes, where the guy accidentally rewrites Don Quixote word for word. Same properties, but two different creations.
Exactly. This shows the tension between neo-Meinongianism and the idea that these things are created. It doesn't really take into account the author and the act of creation.
Right. Which leads us to creationism, also called artifactualism. This one really focuses on the idea of creation.
Right? Creationism emphasizes that authors create these entities by writing, telling stories, etc. And it sees them as abstract artifacts, brought into being by the author. They have beginning in time, and they depend on the author and the works therein. There's this idea of dependence, like historical rigid dependence, meaning the entity depends on its specific author, and constant generic dependence, meaning it depends on the work continuing to exist.
So Hamlet depends on Shakespeare, and on the play, Hamlet continuing to exist.
Exactly.
That feels right.
It does, but there are some challenges. Like some philosophers say that the idea of creation here is too vague. Like how does it actually happen? And when does the entity actually come into being? And just relying on what the author intended is also tricky. Like, what if Doyle intended Holmes and Watson to be the same person but messed up and wrote them as separate? They'd still be separate, right?
Right, intent isn't everything, but creationism seems to have better answers for the Moloch problem and the Don Quixote problem, right?
Right. For Moloch, creationism would say there is no god Moloch as a fictional entity because no one actually created him in a story. And for the Don Quixote thing, you would say there are two different Don Quixotes because there were two different acts of creation, even if the texts are the same.
Okay. But what about, like, those nameless characters,
Yep.
the orcs in the background? Did the author create each of them individually?
Yeah, this is a tough one for creationism. It's hard to believe an author creates every single background character. Some creationists say that those characters don't really exist on their own.
That's interesting.
Right. There's also the question of what is actually created. Is it the object itself or just the author's idea of it? Some say it's only really created when it's shared, like in a text, and people start engaging with it. Others say they're like institutions. They exist because of social rules about fiction, kind of like how rules make a game.
So there are different ways to think about it, even within creationism.
Right.
And what about the properties of fictional entities? Do they really have them, according to creationism?
Generally, creationists say they only have properties according to the story. So Holmes is a detective in the stories, but not in real life. His real properties are things like being a fictional detective or being Doyle's creation.
Okay, so that's different from neo-Monongianism, where they do have the properties.
Right.
And what about individuating fictional entities, like saying when two are the same, especially across different works, or when authorial intent is unclear?
Yeah, that's still tricky. Thomason, for example, she gives some conditions for when characters are the same within one work. But across different works or when authors combine characters, it gets messy.
Right.
The entry also mentions something called a hylomorphist account, which says fictional objects are like arrangements of properties shaped by what the author intended. But even that has a hard time figuring out what the author really intended. So we end our look at metaphysics with this idea that both neo-Monongianism and creationism have weaknesses, but in opposite ways. Maybe someday they can be combined.
So we've had a really philosophical look at what fictional entities are. Now let's move on to whether they actually exist. The ontology of fictional entities. Our source talks about realists and anti-realists.
Right, so the ontology debate is all about whether we should actually believe these things exist. And for a long time, this debate was all about language. Realists point to how we talk about fictional characters and say, see, we talk about them like they're real.
Right.
But anti-realists say that's just how we talk. It doesn't mean they're real.
Okay, so the first big anti-realist idea is Russell's anti-realism.
This is a big one,
Yeah,
right?
this is where the modern debate really got going. So before Russell, there was Frege, who had some anti-realist ideas, but things really took off with this disagreement between Meinong, who was realist, and Russell. Meinong said that just being able to say something like Apollo is young means Apollo has to exist in some way.
Right.
But Russell said, no, names, even fictional ones, are really descriptions in disguise. So Apollo really means something like the sun god. And Russell had this theory about descriptions that let you analyze sentences without needing the thing the name refers to.
Exactly. He showed how you can rephrase sentences like, the sun god is young, using logic without needing a sun god to actually exist. So the sentence ends up being false, but it still makes sense. Russell thought this meant we could talk about fictional characters without them being real.
Okay, but then it seems like sentences like Apollo is young are just false, even though they feel true within the myth. How did anti-realists deal with that?
Well, they said that those sentences are actually shorthand for what they called metafictional sentences, which have this hidden in the fiction part.
Okay.
So Apollo is young really means, according to the Greek myth, Apollo is young. This way you can say the sentence is true, but only in the myth, not in the real world.
So you're not saying anything about a real Apollo.
Right. And Russell's analysis would apply to the part of the sentence that's inside the according to the myth part.
Okay. Now, the source also talked about conniving and non-conniving uses of these sentences. What's the difference?
This is an important point. Conniving is when you're pretending, like an actor or a kid playing. You talk as if the characters are real.
Right.
But non-conniving is when you're talking about the story, like Hamlet is indecisive. Anti-realists use the in the fiction thing to explain these non-conniving uses without having to say Hamlet is real. And they prefer what's called a didicto reading of these sentences, meaning that what's true is the proposition about what the story says, not a claim about an actual Hamlet being indecisive.
So it's about the content of the statement, not whether it refers to a real thing.
Right. But then what about sentences like Mickey Mouse is a pop culture icon or Anna Karenina is a fictional character? These are called external metafictional sentences because they don't mention a specific story. How do anti-realists deal with those?
Yeah, you can't say, according to Disney, Mickey Mouse is a pop culture icon. That doesn't work.
Exactly. Realists say that these sentences show we have to accept fictional entities as real, but some anti-realists say no, even these sentences are within a bigger framework, like according to the fiction of realism.
So it's like, according to the way realists talk, Mickey is an icon. That's a tricky one.
It is. Now we come to the descriptivist problem for theories of fictional names. This goes back to Russell's idea that names are just descriptions.
Right.
But the problem is, some philosophers argue that descriptions don't always match the real thing. And just applying descriptivism to fictional names is weird. Like if Apollo just means the sun god, why would anyone think he was a real person?
Right, right. And if names aren't descriptions, how do anti-realists use that in the fiction strategy? It all falls apart.
Yeah, it's a big problem. And then there's millionism, which says the meaning of a name is the thing it refers to. But if Apollo refers to Apollo and Apollo doesn't exist, then sentences with Apollo don't even make sense.
Right, because there's nothing for the name to refer to.
Exactly. So millions have tried to fix this by saying we're talking about what's implied, or by saying there are gappy propositions that are missing a part, but there's no agreement, especially about those external metafictional sentences.
So, still a lot of debate there. Now let's look at pretense theory. This one focuses on how we use and talk about fiction.
Right. Pretense theory says that make-believe is key to how we deal with fiction. When we read a story, we enter a fictional context where we pretend that the names refer to things.
Hmm.
But outside of that, in the real world, those names are empty. It's all about the context.
So when we say Apollo is young, we're pretending there's an Apollo.
Right.
But then how come it feels true to say that even though it's pretend?
Well, one way is to say that according to the story part, isn't just about a different world, it's about entering the pretend context. But this has problems, especially when you have words like I and here.
Right, because those words depend on the context you're actually in.
Exactly. So a simpler version says that a fictional sentence is true if it's true within the pretense, and the pretense is allowed by the text or film or whatever. And for those tricky external metafictional sentences, like about Mickey Mouse, Walton talks about unofficial games of make-believe. So for Mickey Mouse as a pop culture icon, we're not pretending within a specific story, but within a larger game of make-believe where we all know about Mickey's cultural impact. This way, we can say the sentence is true without Mickey actually existing.
Okay, so it's like a broader kind of pretending, but there are still criticisms of the theory, right?
Right. Like, how can truth in a pretense make something true in the real world? And are these unofficial games well-defined enough?
This back and forth between realists and anti-realists is never ending. Now, what about quantificational arguments for realism? These are about sentences that use words like there is or for all.
Right. Realists say that sentences like there is a fictional character who show that we have to believe in fictional characters. Because if those sentences can be true, there must be something that they're true about.
Okay.
Like if we can say there is a fictional character in every Bond film, then there must be fictional characters.
Right. But anti-realists have something to say about this too, right?
They do. They point out that we can make sentences like that about things we know don't exist. Like, there is an imaginary emperor of China.
Okay.
So just because we can make a sentence like that doesn't mean the thing exists. It's about how language works, not about what actually exists.
Okay, that makes sense. Finally, let's look at ontological arguments for and against realism. These are about the reasons for believing or not believing in fictional entities apart from language.
Right. So some realists say that, look, we accept that stories exist as physical things, so why not accept the characters exist too? They're both creations.
Right. Both are made by people.
And another argument says that the characters are part of what makes a story what it is.
Okay, so the characters are essential to the story's identity.
Exactly. Now, on the other side, anti-realists say fictional entities can't exist. Like Russell argued that it would lead to contradictions. And more recently, Greg Everett has said that it would mess with logic and lead to characters having undefined identities.
Right, like that example with the nursery rhyme about Baru and Bara, where we don't know if it's one or two characters.
Exactly. Everett says that kind of thing is a big problem. But then realists have their counter-arguments. They say Everett's wrong about how stories connect to characters, and that just because a story doesn't say something definitively doesn't mean the character is undefined.
Okay.
They say the author's intent matters, and some say the problem just with our language, not with the characters themselves. And neo-Meinungians use their ideas about negation and predication to address these problems too. So the debate goes on.
Wow. We've gone deep into this, a real philosophical deep dive. We've looked at what fictional entities might be and whether they actually exist, and there are no easy answers. It's all still being debated.
Exactly. And all these different views, they help us understand how our minds work, how we use language, and how we see the difference between reality and fiction.
Right. Thinking about this stuff makes you think about everything differently.
Absolutely. And so we leave you with this question. How does your view about fictional entities change how you see stories? Does it change how you understand the characters, what they do, and what they mean to us?
It's something to think about. And maybe do some more reading on this. Check out the Stanford Encyclopedia. But for now, thanks for joining us. Keep questioning everything, both real and imagined.